Now, lately, I have been using ChatGPT as one of my resources for sermons. Now, no, it isn't writing them for me. I'm not pulling that trick. Instead, what I have been doing is after I've made a lot of different notes and then gone through them and highlighted the ones that I like the most, I put that into ChatGPT and ask it to suggest a sermon outline. Often this is a helpful thought exercise. And sometimes it comes up with an amazing gem. And this week it proposed a big question based on the readings and my notes. And it was one that I thought was good enough to use. So the big question this week is, what does God expect from us? And the cost of faith is high. And our three readings today provide very clear guidance. And the short answer, God expects a lot. First, we heard from Isaiah. In it, we heard God speak of extreme disappointment. God had created a vineyard which is Israel, but it had produced only wild grapes, injustice and bloodshed, instead of justice and righteousness. God was planning on letting the vineyard be devoured. This is another passage where we can really feel God's sadness and disappointment. There is some anger here, but it's mostly divine grief. God asks of God's self, "What more could I have done?" Here we can clearly see what God does not expect from us in hard times. The people of God, the people that God was speaking to, had given in to greed, land grabs, and oppression of the poor. So, we know what not to do, but there's more. God expects us to do better than simply refraining from doing good, from doing evil. Important distinction. God expects more than we simply refrain from doing evil. We are to bear fruit, good fruit, like justice and righteousness. And today we continue to hear from the letter to the Hebrews about how much God had done for God's people. People of faith had done great things through and for their faith, all the way up to death. And we were told that we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, believers who have gone on to the kingdom before us. And finally, we heard to keep our eyes on Christ as our role model. The author of Hebrews is reinforcing that our heroes in the faith, the prophets and martyrs, both old and new, persevered through faith. The world was not worthy of them, and so they returned to God. And they are still with us through their wisdom and example. They are the great cloud of witnesses, and they continue to witness to us and guide us to endure our own struggles for the faith. This passage is also providing clear guidance on what God expects from us. We're being told that our job is to be connected with one another. That believers across space and time, living and dead, are all interconnected. And that our faith is not to be passive, but active. We are to respond to God's call with obedience and perseverance, even in the midst of hardship. We are not guaranteed that our prayers will be answered, nor are we promised worldly success. However, we are being comforted and reminded that we will never be alone as we endure our own race until the end. Our final reading today is a doozy, one that many preachers would probably try to avoid. Alas, I cannot. We heard Jesus proclaim, "I came to bring fire to the earth." And he rhetorically asked the disciples, "Do you think that I came to bring peace to the earth? No, I tell you, but rather division." He said that there would be divisions, even within families. And then he denounced people as hypocrites for interpreting the weather, but not the present time. Now, Luke's gospel is typically about reconciliation. Not here. Here, Jesus is clearly telling us that the cost of faith is high, very high. He's reinforcing that believing in God will not make you popular. It will not lead to riches. It will not lead to safety and security. Instead, following Jesus will lead to conflict and division. Jesus does not desire this conflict or division, but they are a natural response to his radical call for love, justice, and reversing the power structures of this world. Now, what God and Jesus expects from us, or expect from us, is also quite clear here. In 1958, a Southern preacher wrote a book that had a powerful line that tells us what Jesus expects. True peace is not merely the absence of tension, it is the presence of justice. In that book, Martin Luther King, Jr., told the story of the Montgomery bus boycotts in the early days of the Civil Rights Movement. God expects us to not merely be peacemakers, but to be strong and forceful advocates for justice for all people, especially the marginalized and the voiceless. And we are expected to carefully and properly interpret our own age, not simply bury our heads in the sand to avoid conflict. And as I thought of the high cost of faith, I could not help but be drawn to the story of a young seminarian, Jonathan Daniels. He was born in New Hampshire in 1939. And in the fall of 1963, he began attending an Episcopal seminary. During Daniel's second year, that same Southern preacher I mentioned earlier issued a call. He summoned students and clergy from around the country to come to Selma, Alabama, to help in their efforts to expand voting rights. And in March of 1965, Daniels and a classmate went to Selma with the intent of a very brief trip. But he found himself there. He ended up remaining there for the rest of the semester, went back and took exams, and then came back in July. John worked to register voters and integrate the local Episcopal Church. And both of these efforts garnered rather significant pushback, to say the least. On August 14th, 1965, Daniels joined a group of 29 protesters who went to a nearby town to picket outside of whites-only businesses. They were arrested, held for 6 days. Upon release, the group waited to be picked up by friends. And Jonathan, a white Catholic priest, and 2 black female activists went over to a store that served non-whites to pick up a cold drink. At the door stood a special deputy with a shotgun. The man pointed the shotgun at a 17-year-old volunteer. Jonathan moved quickly, put himself between the shotgun and that young woman, Ruby Sales. The man fired, and Jonathan Daniels was killed. And he also shot the Catholic priest, severely wounding him. The man who murdered him and tried to murder that priest and others was acquitted of manslaughter by an all-white jury. When Martin Luther King Jr. heard of what had happened, he's quoted as saying, "One of the most heroic Christian deeds of which I have heard in my entire ministry was performed by Jonathan Daniels." And this coming Wednesday, August 20th, will mark the 60th anniversary of his martyrdom. So, what does God expect from us when the cost of faith is high? Everything. Our faith compels us to act, to be active voices for justice and righteousness, not give in to greed and selfish ambition. We are to persevere through our struggles, knowing that we are surrounded by those who have gone before us. We are to accept that Jesus' message will bring conflict and division. And so, let us honor the teachings and examples of the great cloud of witnesses, including Jonathan Daniels. Strive to remain connected to one another and allow the fire that Jesus brings to refine us and empower us to bear great fruit. For the cost of faith is high, but we do not bear it alone. Amen.